So thinking about Vancouver, right? Beautiful scenery. The city life is bustling. But before you even think about packing your bags, there's that one question, renting or buying. We've got Leda on the Vancouver housing market, and we'll help you break it all down, especially if you're maybe a middle-class family or just arrived in Vancouver.
It's a hot market for sure, that's for sure. Did you know that in Vancouver, over half the families rent?
Really?
Yeah, 54.5% if you look at the 2021 census.
Wow. I had no idea it was that many people. I guess those Vancouver views come with a pretty big price tag, huh?
Oh, yeah, for sure. A downtown 3-bedroom apartment could easily be $3,000 to $3,500 a month.
Just for rent?
Yeah, just for rent. And buying. Detached home, you're looking at about $1.5 million.
Oof. Yeah, even condos are like $700,000 to $1 million.
Okay, so it's pretty clear why renting's so popular, at least to start out. But let's look closer at what it all means for a middle-class family. Someone making, say, $80,000 to $150,000 per year. If they're thinking 5 to 10 years out, what's the financial side look like? Well, renting would cost you about $3,175 a month, and that includes stuff like utilities and insurance.
Okay.
That's almost $38,100 every year. So over 5 years, that's about $190,500, and over a decade, it's $381,000.
So renting definitely seems more affordable, at least in the short term. What about if that same family bought a place? What would that look like over those same 5 to 10 years?
Let's take that $1.5 million house as an example. 20% down payment, so $300,000 up front.
Okay.
And say a 30-year mortgage at 4% interest, your monthly payment would be about $5,700. Then you got to add property taxes, insurance, maintenance. All that ends up being around $8,140 per year.
Okay.
And almost $977,000 over a decade.
That's a huge difference. So for 5 to 10 years, renting seems way more manageable, especially if you aren't sure about staying in Vancouver long term.
Yeah, and that flexibility is a big plus for a lot of families. But we can't forget about the good things about buying. After 10 years, your mortgage would be down about $950,000, so you've built $250,000 in equity. And if Vancouver property values keep going up like they have historically at like 5% a year, that $1.5 million house could be worth $2.4 million.
So even though buying's a bigger commitment at first, it could pay off big time down the road.
Exactly. It depends on how much risk you're comfortable with your finances and how long you plan to stay in Vancouver.
So let's say this family really loves Vancouver and decides to settle down long term. We're talking 10 years or more. How does renting versus buying look then?
Now, that's where it gets interesting. Remember that $3,175 a month for rent? With even just a 4% increase each year, you'd be spending over $1.1 million on rent over 20 years.
And the big thing with renting is after all that time, you haven't built any ownership, right?
You got it. You're basically just helping someone else build their investment. Now, if you look at buying for those same 20 years, you'd spend about $1.95 million total. But your mortgage would be down to around $650,000, which means you'd have $850,000 in equity.
Huge difference. And what about the property itself after those 20 years?
Well, if the Vancouver market keeps going the way it has, that $1.5 million house could be worth like $4 million.
Wow. So even though buying costs more upfront, it could have huge long-term gains, both in how much equity you build and how much the property goes up in value.
For sure. So for those committed to Vancouver, long-term buying seems like a pretty safe bet.
It definitely seems worth thinking about. But let's not forget about newcomers to the city. They often come with some savings, maybe $200,000 to $500,000, but they're still figuring things out. Should they jump right into buying?
I mean, it's tempting, right? Especially if you've got savings. But those first few years, renting just makes more sense. Like 5 years of rent is about $190,000. That's less than half what you'd spend on mortgage payments and property taxes alone if you bought.
Yeah, I see why that would be appealing, less to worry about when you're still figuring everything out.
Right. Newcomers are checking out jobs, neighborhoods, getting a feel for Vancouver life. Renting gives you that flexibility. Buying, though, comes with that big $300,000 down payment property transfer tax, $5,700 every month for the mortgage.
Yeah, and what if the market goes down or they have to move for work? That could mean selling at a loss.
Yeah, that's tough. Renting gives you time to, like, breathe, build up that credit history, really get to know the city before you make such a big commitment.
Okay, so say a newcomer rents for a few years. When does buying start to make more sense financially?
Once things are more stable, steady job neighborhood, they love a better idea of their plans long term. That's when buying starts to look better.
And what does that timeline usually look like?
Here's a way to think about it. 10 years of rent could easily be $500,000 and then you still don't own anything. Buying, even though it's more expensive up front at around $970,000 over that same decade, it lets you build equity and maybe even profit from the property going up in value.
So it's a long-term play, but I imagine there are still some challenges for newcomers, even if they wait a while before buying.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Getting a mortgage can be tricky without a Canadian credit history. Some lenders might want a bigger down payment or give you a higher interest rate.
It's a lot extra.
It is, but it doesn't apply to permanent residents, so newcomers need to know about these things.
So buying might make sense eventually, but it's not something to jump into.
Right. You really got to plan it out, do your research, maybe even talk to a financial advisor who specializes in newcomers.
Okay, let's get into some actual numbers. For a middle-class family, what are the month-to-month costs like for renting versus buying?
Sure. So for a 3-bedroom apartment, rents about $3,000 on average. Then you got to add utilities like electricity, heating, internet, probably another $400 a month. So you're looking at like $3,400 total each month for renting.
Got it. And how does that compare to owning?
Okay, let's say a townhouse, something a little closer to that average price in Vancouver. We're talking around $1,231,922. With 20% down, that's $246,384 up front.
Still a lot of money.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Then with a 5-year fixed mortgage at, say, 4.7% interest over 25 years, your monthly payment would be about $5,594. Then add property taxes, which would be around $425 for a place like that, plus home insurance at like $194 and maybe $125 a month for maintenance.
So altogether about $6,338 a month to own that townhouse.
Yeah. Now zoom out a bit. Over 10 years, those rental costs would be $408,000. For the townhouse, including that down payment, you're at $1,006,944.
Big difference. But you also have to think about how much that property could go up in value.
Right, exactly. If we assume like a 5% increase each year, that $1,231,922 townhouse could be worth about $2,005,372 after 10 years.
So you've spent over $1 million, but the place is worth way more.
Right. And if you subtract the mortgage balance, which would be around $721,222 after those 10 years, your net worth's actually gone up by $1,284,150.
That's a good argument for buying.
It is. But remember, this is just one point in time. What if we look 10 years further out, so 20 years total?
Okay, how do those numbers look then?
Well, renting for 20 years with those little increases each year would cost you a crazy $816,000 and you still own nothing. But if you'd bought that townhouse, your total spent, including the down payment, would be around $7,767,504.
Again, a much bigger number to start. But what's the property worth after those 20 years?
With that same 5% increase, it could be worth something like $3,267,822. And your mortgage would be down to just $297,500.
So your net worth is almost $3 million. That's a huge difference compared to renting.
It is. This really shows you the power of time in real estate. The longer you own a place, the more you benefit from that value going up and building equity.
It's amazing to see how those numbers change over time. But let's go back to those newcomers. What advice would you give them as they're figuring out this housing market?
Don't rush. Take your time, get to know Vancouver, find a job in a neighborhood you like, build up your credit history. Renting lets you do that.
And what if they're thinking about buying later on?
Do your homework. Look into programs like the First-Time Home Buyer Incentive, which can help lower your monthly payments, and talk to a financial advisor who gets the challenges newcomers face.
It sounds like knowing what you're doing is really important. The more newcomers know, the better they can make those big decisions.
Absolutely, and it's not even just the numbers. You know, newcomers need to think about their lifestyle if they have family and what their goals are. Like, if they have kids buying in a certain neighborhood, to be in a specific school district might be really important.
That makes sense. School districts are a big deal for families.
Yeah, for sure. But for someone without kids, they might want to be able to move around easily, and renting makes more sense. It all depends on what they need.
So there's no one answer when it comes to renting or buying in Vancouver.
Right. It comes down to each person's situation, their money, and what they're aiming for.
This has been so helpful. We've covered so much, from how much properties cost to what newcomers have to deal with. As we wrap up our look at the Vancouver housing market, what's one last piece of advice for our listeners who are still deciding between renting and buying?
Don't be scared of the market. Whether you've been in Vancouver forever or just got here, the more you know, the better. Understand your finances, look at your options, and don't be afraid to ask for help from someone who knows what they're doing. Vancouver's a great city with a lot to offer, and finding the right place to live is a big part of making it feel like home.
I love that. Thanks for taking us through the Vancouver housing market.
Yeah.
We hope this helps you figure out how to find that perfect place in this incredible city.